A word that could perhaps be applied to the 1950s in the United States is massive. Last time we talked a little bit about massive retaliation, the idea that the United States would use the nuclear deterrent as opposed to conventional weapons to fight communism. Also, the 50s was the golden age of mass consumer culture. We'll talk about that later. But we also get a growing mass movement in the 1950s in the form of the civil rights movement. And we get the white backlash against that, which was referred to as massive resistance. One of the first things that President Eisenhower had an opportunity to do after taking office in 1953 was to nominate a new Chief Justice for the United States Supreme Court. The man that Eisenhower nominated for that important position was Earl Warren of California. Warren had a record that made him look like a pretty safe conservative choice for Eisenhower, but over his tenure as Chief Justice, which ended in 1969, Warren presided over some of the most liberal decisions in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, and Eisenhower later said that appointing Earl Warren Chief Justice was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. And certainly if he wanted a conservative justice, then it was a mistake. Warren decided early in his tenure that soon the Supreme Court would have to deal with segregation, which was pervasive throughout the entire South and to some extent in other parts of the country. 58 years earlier, in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling had said that it was entirely acceptable to have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were of equal quality. This pretty much gave the South a green light to go ahead and segregate virtually every area of life. One of the main problems with separate but equal, of course, is that there was very little real concern about whether the separate facilities provided for African Americans were truly equal in quality to those provided for whites, which they almost never were. At any rate, there had been a slow chipping away at Jim Crow, as the system was called, by the federal courts in the late 30s and 40s. And so by the early 50s, it was only a matter of time before the Supreme Court took up a case involving segregated public schools. Warren wanted to make sure that any ruling concerning overturning separate but equal was unanimous. Most of the justices seemed to be on board with overturning Plessy anyway, but Warren worked behind the scenes to convince all 9 justices, or the other 8 besides himself, that the time had come to overturn separate but equal. And on May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling in the case of Oliver Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was the landmark decision in which the Supreme Court, by a unanimous 9-0 ruling, overturned separate but equal. The court could have heard any number of cases challenging segregated public schools, but I think one reason it chose the case out of Topeka, Kansas, is that Kansas was not a southern state, but it still had segregated schools. And so this made it look a little bit less like an all-out attack on the South. At any rate, the Warren court understood how upsetting this was going to be, particularly to white Southerners, so they decided to move cautiously. They delayed the implementation decree by a year. So it was not until May of 1955 that the Supreme Court issued its implementation order in a case that's sometimes referred to as Brown 2. In the Brown 2 ruling, the Supreme Court said that desegregation of public education must begin with all deliberate speed. That phrase was open to some interpretation, but at any rate, things now begin to move forward, albeit slowly. Token integration of public schools in the South began almost immediately. But at any rate, there is pushback against all of this, and Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia sort of took the lead in what he called massive resistance to the Brown decision. Massive resistance basically involved using all possible legal challenges against the Brown decision. Now, of course, some white Southerners decided not to worry about legality. The Ku Klux Klan was reorganized, for example, along with the White Citizens Councils. But a major showdown over massive resistance came in 1957 when the federal courts ordered Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas to be integrated. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, called out the Arkansas National Guard and refused to admit African-American students when they came to register at Little Rock Central. President Eisenhower, up to this point, had done relatively little with regard to civil rights. In fact, he was not very pleased with the Brown decision, not because he was necessarily a hardline segregationist, but because he was afraid that if you moved too far too fast, you could end up with a race war. But when Governor Faubus openly defied a federal court order to integrate Little Rock Central High, Eisenhower decided that that would not be tolerated, and he sent elements of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, to Little Rock to make sure that the black students were, in fact, enrolled. Some said this was too little too late on Eisenhower's part, but the fact is Eisenhower's show of force in support of a federal court order in Little Rock did, to some extent, break the back of massive resistance. Meanwhile, African Americans themselves were increasingly taking the lead in the struggle for civil rights. In 1955, there was an especially gruesome murder that took place in Mississippi. A 14-year-old African American from Chicago, Emmett Till, made what turned out to be a literally fatal mistake when he went to visit his grandparents in Mississippi. Supposedly, although the main accuser later, many years later, admitted that this actually didn't happen, Till was accused of whistling and making suggestive remarks to a white woman. That night, Till was kidnapped from his grandparents' house, brutally murdered, and then his body was sunk in a nearby river. It was recovered a short time later, bloated and, of course, disfigured. And, of course, this was not the first time that an African American had been murdered. What made the Emmett Till case especially important, though, was that his mother decided to have an open casket at his funeral, which, of course, seemed horrifying to a lot of people. But she said, "I just wanted the world to know what they did to my boy." And many people say the Emmett Till case really launched, in some respects, the civil rights movement, because when Rosa Parks, who, of course, began, in a sense, the Montgomery bus boycott in December of 1955 by refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery city bus in Alabama as required by local law, she was asked, why did you decide to do this now? And she said, when I thought of what they did to poor Emmett Till, I decided I had to do something. Anyway, this is the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. And a young Baptist minister in Montgomery named Martin Luther King Jr. Eventually emerged as the leader of the boycott. And of course, over the next decade, King would emerge as, in many ways, the acknowledged leader of the entire civil rights movement. Dr. King was somewhat reluctant in the beginning to lead the boycott, but at any rate, it worked. Most of the whites in Montgomery did not believe that blacks were serious about boycotting the bus system because they felt like, how else are they going to get to work? Most of them don't have cars. It's too far to walk. But the fact is, for about a year, most African Americans in Montgomery did boycott the bus system. They carpooled, they walked, and eventually the local business community called for an end to segregated buses because it was hurting their business and their image. And eventually the court stepped in and made some rulings outlawing segregation in public transportation. But in many ways, Montgomery was just the beginning, certainly not the end. And among other things, it does mark the emergence of Martin Luther King as the main leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement. King would consolidate his position as the leader of the movement in the late 50s by organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And of course, the movement would really peak in the early to mid 60s. That, of course, is a pretty familiar story, but we'll have more to say about that later.